Now to introduce our speaker and to conduct the question period, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce John Burens, President of the Unitarian Universalist Association, to present the Melcher Book Award and introduce Mr. Rosenblatt. Dr. Burens, a pastor by trade, served churches from my own town of Lexington to Knoxville, Dallas, New York City, a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard, an author, a community activist. He is the newly elected leader of this old yet ever new and evolving community of liberal religious congregations. It is a pleasure to welcome him not just to the Ford Hall Forum, but to the Boston area, to the Boston community. We're looking forward to having him as a part of this area's life once again, and to hearing from him on many occasions and about a number of different things. Dr. Burens.
Thank you, Dan. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the 1,000 congregations that constitute the Unitarian Universalist Association all across this continent to take part in this Ford Hall Forum this evening and to present the annual award of the association, which is given in honor of Frederick G. Melcher, during his lifetime considered to be the dean and indeed the conscience of American publishers. The award is granted, as Dan said, to the book that published over the past year has been deemed to have made the greatest contribution to the spirit of liberal religion. Roger Rosenblatt's work in Life Itself, Abortion and the American Mind, reminds us that the spirit of religious liberalism is one that understands that the authority for each of us in our spiritual lives must be shaped in dialogue, in true community, and yet judged ultimately according to the test of conscience that each of us can alone grapple with. We live in an age where no issue is more painful or divisive than the questions of life itself that surround the national debate over abortion. With this book, Roger Rosenblatt has taken great care, in the spirit of tonight's gathering, to honor the issues of conscience on every side of the debate, while ultimately his position about legislation, like my own, comes down on the side of supporting the rights of conscience and choice. At no time does he demean those whose reverence for life has made them feel that abortion is at best a regrettable and tragic choice, or to suggest that anyone who makes that choice or resists it is less smart or less worthy of worth or less socially aware. In fact, the book offers compelling testimonies from people of deep conscience on both sides of the issue. It's an example that in the midst of our battle over legal and constitutional rights, we would be wise to follow in the spirit of this evening. Honor the opinion of each. Talk to one another. Shape the conscience in dialogue. Listen and have an open mind. This is reverence for life at its best in community, acknowledging that abortion is in many ways a violation of the natural order, that it is in fact the taking of life. Roger Rosenblatt does not deny that the social and moral issues that must be faced in trying to shape a decent society are filled with ambiguities. The majority of Americans, he states, recognize, but are unwilling to acknowledge sometimes the conflicts within. None of us are pro-abortion, and yet how often do we, who are claimed to be pro-choice, recognize in the midst of the rhetoric of constitutional rights that we have sometimes neglected the pain that we feel about a society in which life itself may indeed be in danger of being demeaned. One of the great crippling social tendencies of the last 25 years, he says, is that Americans think about rights rather than about what is right. Those rights are critically important, and we must fight to maintain them. But even as we fight, can we not work together to eliminate the need for abortion, or at least diminish it? Volumes have been written on the topic. Life itself offers a new approach toward a resolution. It calls us to affirm each person's worth and dignity, even when we might respectfully disagree. It calls for compassion in human relationships and for trust in the democratic method. Perhaps most important, it calls us to acknowledge not only our rational and cerebral selves, but also our spiritual and moral selves as partners in the dialogue. Tonight here in the audience, we have the judges of the Melcher Book Award Committee, Dr. Dan Fenn, Janet Steiner of Vestal, New York, the Reverend Arlene Sutherland of Winchester, Massachusetts, the distinguished educator Dr. Gwendolyn Thomas of Aurora, Colorado, Dr. Richard Turner of New York, and Patricia Freevert of Boston. I'd like the judges of the Melcher Book Award to stand for just a moment, if they mightn't be recognized. Their citation, which will be presented this evening, reads as follows. The judges of the Melcher Book Award take special pride in awarding the 1993 prize to Roger Rosenblatt for his in-depth study of the national agony over abortion. Life itself, abortion in the American mind, gives a much-needed new look at this intensely divisive controversy, which is deeply rooted in conflicting values and definitions of what is good and what is right. In his insightful search for a position that is intellectually acceptable and operationally effective, in his refusal to succumb to the extremes at either end of the continuum, Rosenblatt reflects the values of liberal religion. He treats both sides with respect, empathy, and understanding, but he also struggles mentally and emotionally with the task of reframing the question and fashioning an answer that will serve us at this time and place. Rosenblatt has done more than think and feel his way through this one searing issue. He has given us a model of how a free society can work through important and profound differences. We celebrate diversity in the abstract, but are often tortured and frustrated when we try to deal with the inevitable results as they express themselves in public policy decisions, which assault our own value systems. How do we resolve these conflicts in a way that the body politic suffers the least possible damage and as few individuals as possible feel personally violated? Life itself helps us to see our way in this intensely significant dilemma. It points out the lessons to be learned from this particular debate, lessons that can and should be applied as we struggle with other equally divisive issues. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to welcome Roger Rosenblatt here tonight, to present him with that award and the tangible symbol of our esteem for his work. His distinguished career in journalism began in 1975 when he became the literary editor for The New Republic, and shortly thereafter a columnist for The Washington Post. He has since served in various editorial and writing positions for Time magazine, for U.S. News and World Report, and for Life. He is currently a contributing editor and essayist for Vanity Fair, The New Republic, Family Circle, Men's Journal, and a regular essayist on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour on PBS. His books include Black Fiction, Children of War, and Witness, The World Since Hiroshima. Children of War won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize and was nominated by the National Book Critics Circle as one of the 5 best works of nonfiction in 1983. It is indicative of his range that tonight he addresses us on yet another important topic of the day: why journalism fails to tell us the news. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you Roger Rosenblatt.
Thanks very much. Let me begin by apologizing for the title of this talk, which sounds like one of those deliberately provocative titles speakers are always asked to come up with to draw crowds, which it is. I've always been leery of titles since I worked at Time magazine. My friends and I used to collect books whose titles attracted us. These are real books and real titles. We put them on a special shelf. One book was God and Vitamins. Another was Socialism for the Dead. Do reindeer experience religious ecstasy? This was one of a number of pet books. They were very popular. Alan Coren, the editor of Punch, once asked his agent what kind of books sell the best. He had never written a book that sold any copies. The agent said books about golf and about Nazis and about cats. So Coren wrote a book called Golfing for Cats with a swastika on the cover. One of the favorites of the boys in the office was a book called 1637, A Year of No Significance. And my own favorite was a business book, computer book called Using Your Wang for Business. I also have little authority to lecture on journalism, so I apologize for that too. I actually have little authority in general. Also at Time, we were living in Vermont when I got the job at Time, or at least was asked about the job. I went down to talk to the editor then, a great editor named Ray Cave, very dour man, wore a beard, looked like Captain Ahab, or what Rockwell Kent imagined Captain Ahab to look like. We had a conversation that went just fine. The assignment was fine, and the money was fine. In those days, any money would have been fine. But I wanted to show him that I had some authority, so I said, well, my voice cracking because I was about to tell a lie. I said, well, I'm used to 4 weeks vacation. Now, this was both true and not true. At the Washington Post, where I worked, I got 3 weeks vacation, but when I used to teach in a university, I got 3 months vacation. So I figured the whole thing averaged out. Well, I'm used to 4 weeks vacation. I looked at Cave, Cave looked at me. I could tell, he could tell. He wasn't dealing with any corn-fed, he wasn't dealing with any rube. I could tell he could sense my authority. Well, Roger, he said after a pause, we ordinarily start with 5 weeks. But in your case, we'll make an exception. I do have a subject. It's more positive than the negative title, Why Journalism Fails to Tell the News, would suggest. The subject is why journalism, or how journalism might get closer to the truth of experience and more satisfy journalists and the public. So I've dreamed up rules, 9 rules in all, which I believe might shift the focus of the trade. Tonight, then, I'd like to use those rules to make this case. The rules may be of use to journalists, but I mean them to apply to everyone. Anyone interested in the experience of words and the experience conveyed by words. So my talk is not meant for journalists, but I hope you won't mind if I present these rules as if I were talking to young journalists in particular, because by this method I can be clearest and what I mean by each of the rules. So let me state the rules first, then I'll try to explain them. As you will hear, they will require explanation. 1, be out of things. 2, be slow. 3, write dead stories. 4, go to hell. 5, distrust rational thought. 6, be beside the point. 7, avoid the company of people. 8, betray your sources. 9, most important, do not understand it. Okay, one at a time. Be out of things. I mean that literally. In the movie Humoresque, Oscar Vance said to Joan Crawford or John Garfield, I forget whom, "Don't blame me, I didn't make the world, I barely live on it." I believe that is a useful stance by which to apprehend most experience. Create an atmosphere in which you deliberately generalize experience. We live in a time when specialized thought is so rampant that it takes a variety of forms which can tear a society apart. We used to practice and cultivate a general education. Now we no longer do so. Now we hit on the narrow focus. If I were to suggest to people who wanted to go into journalism now something to do first, I would ask them to watch Citizen Kane again. Citizen Kane is, as you know, a movie about journalism, although it appears to be about several other things. And it involves the narrow quest, the narrow answer. You may remember the reporter is asked to discover what is meant by Rosebud, the last word of Charles Foster Kane. And the movie consists of the entire journey of that reporter to discover what is meant by Rosebud. He never discovers it, of course. The revelation of the sled at the end exists without him being present. But he does discover something about Charles Foster Kane by asking people who do not know what Rosebud is. By pursuing the narrow focus, he never gets to the kinds of questions that would answer who is Charles Foster Kane. But the narrow focus is the pursuit that is most encouraged, and it's most encouraged now. Everybody moves towards specialties now. Specialty magazines, Wood, Teeth, Alute Life. Specialized television, this information highway, for example, is all about individualizing one's life so that you can stay at home and order your life up so that it suits you particularly. It will be very interesting to see what consequences the information highway has for politicians who decide to segment their political opinions as to the predispositions of an audience. Specialized thinking leads to a specialized country, rich separated from poor, race from race, ethnic separations, to a segmented, separate, specialized world. The tribalism that came to such terrible, and continues to come to such terrible bloody consequences in Bosnia, it's all a matter of specialization. I returned from the Sudan last spring, where I saw the consequences of specialized thought, ethnic cleansing, the theocratic cleansing, all in the idea of specializing one's thought, of being a member of the right tribe, of eliminating the wrong tribe. Being out of things involves avoiding the news. This seems like an odd thing to say to journalists, and it may make difficult one's conversations with one's employers. I don't mean avoiding the news entirely. I mean reading just enough to have an understanding of it and then getting off it. If you really want to understand the news, read history, read poetry, read fiction. These things, from a side, again, being out of it, move you into a subject far more directly. You watch John McEnroe a number of years ago try to make a comeback as a tennis player. And you watch McEnroe more and more frustrated. You try to understand what is really going on in the mind of somebody who was indisputably the greatest tennis player of his day. And you see what he is working with is that he has no discipline. He cannot move to the normal kind of training that lesser players would because McEnroe was a natural. And he only knew how to behave as a natural. If you want to understand what John McEnroe went through, I wouldn't look at the scores or the arc of his serve or count any statistics in his game. I would read Bernard Malamud's The Natural. It will tell you more about McEnroe than any kind of direct observation. If you wanted to understand about George Bush, not that I recommend it, but if you'd want to understand about George Bush, you could go through the normal political spectrum and apply your scrutiny to it, or you could read Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, and you would understand what it means to have somebody to deal with somebody living in an ambitious, a peculiarly ambitious context where all life consisted of rising and rising and rising until you rise to the point where you cannot rise anymore, and you look and you act entirely lost. A man with no center. I believe Bush had no center. That's why he could not speak English. Being out of things involves a connection with nature. A couple of years ago, I saw a really remarkable photograph out of Paris. French farmers were protesting something of the European market, European community. And they brought sheep and cows and ducks into the Champs-Élysées and slabs of wheat fields, which they put right in the middle of the city. It's really a remarkable sight. You saw this countryside rising in the middle of Paris. The police were braced for some sorts of riots that would result that would result from their actions. What happened instead was that lovers started to walk through the fields. Police, along with regular citizens. There were no riots, there were no fights. What the people responded to was a sudden reawakening of something that Matthew Arnold called the buried life, a kind of life within all of us that finds its moment, then rises to the surface in the strangest provocations. This attachment, this sudden countryside rising in the middle of the city, they remembered that visceral attachment to nature. We have lost our connection to nature in the last years, meaning the 20, 30, 50 years, and we pay severe penalties for it. But then suddenly, in this city, in that moment, there it was. I believe that the impulse behind the environmental movement is the wish to restore that connection, not to clean the air, not to address the problem of the ozone layer. These are true things, and people wish them done, and they should be. But the basic impulse is to restore our connection to nature. Be out of it. Being out of it involves living in the past. People tell you to live ardently in the present. Remember in Thornton Wilder's play, Skin of Our Teeth, there's a gypsy who says, a fortune teller, who says, your future. You want me to tell your future? Anybody can tell your future. What you want to know is your past. How do you know your past? Live in the past. Cultivate it. Find yourself a place of comfort in it. It involves cultivating a dream state, being out of it, of knowing something about the inarticulate aspects of one's life. It's very easy to know the articulate aspects of your life and the linear aspects of your life. But these things, which are as real, the imagination is surely as real as aspects of reality. There's not enough attention to the cultivation of that to the tune of one's life. Mark Twain used to curse a lot, and his wife, Livy, wanted to cure him of the habit. So one morning, Twain lost a collar button or something, and he let fly with the usual barrage. Goddamn, gruff, ruff, 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 ruff. His wife, wanting to show him how ugly such language sounded, repeated verbatim what her husband had said. Goddamn, ruff, ruff, ruff. Twain stepped back, looked affectionately at his wife, and said, Livy, you know the words, but you don't know the tune. So know the tune. A state of reverie. Cultivate a state of reverie. Everybody argues against doing that. Go against that grain. A state of reverie does not avoid reality, said Somerset Maugham. It accedes to reality. Rule number 2, be slow. Wait on experience until you define it. It's anathema for journalists, of course, but journalists and for citizens generally, to get things fast, to get a story fast, to get experience fast. Yet only by waiting on experience will you get it. Think of what it must have been like for the citizens of then the Soviet Union. That weekend when the powers met in the Politburo, emerged after the weekend in front of these crowds of tens of thousands, 100,000 people, and said, we have met now, and we've decided that you don't have to vote for the Communist Party, you can vote for every party. In other words, they stood in front of representatives of citizens who had heard another line for 60 years and said, just kidding, we hadn't meant it. What could it mean to understand that? If you want to understand Russia today, apart from the stories that come out of Russia, understand what it must have meant to live with a lie. I mean, really live with a lie, a full, national, deep-seated, permeating lie, all those years, and have been told it was a lie by the people who were lying to you. Václav Havel wrote an essay about a man in Czechoslovakia, a shopkeeper who used to put a sign in his window every morning, "Workers of the world unite." He had no trust in it, had no sense of the meaning of it at all, but he would do it every day to recapitulate the lie. I used to see, when I went to the Soviet Union, I did a piece on a day in the life of the Soviet Union to accompany the photographs. The hospital worker of the month, the teacher of the month. What could it mean to compete in a society there for prominence, for excellence in a society in which the basis was a lie? What does it mean to live a lie? A number of years ago, 2 kids from high school, say their names were Jones and Smith, applied to Harvard together for admission. Smith got into Harvard. Jones did not. Smith wrote to Harvard and said that he was not coming. He was going to go to Yale. Jones, suffering the pressures of his family, the inordinate pressures of his family, wrote another letter to Harvard under Smith's name, said he changed his mind and he was going to come anyway. He was going to come after all. So Jones, now, under the name Smith, enters Harvard and hides out. He gets some special dispensation so he doesn't have to live in the yard, and he hides out for a term. And he's doing fine. As everybody knows, the hard part of Harvard is getting in. That's the second hardest part. The really hardest part is being thrown out. Anyway, he's doing fine, but in the middle of, there is one moment, or there used to be one moment in a freshman year, where if you were getting a grade below C or below, a note would be sent back to your parents to let them know you weren't doing so well in that course or those courses. So, our friend Jones, now as Smith, gets a C in one course. A note is sent back to his parents, but of course it's not sent back to his parents. It's sent back to Smith's parents. Smith's parents write back to Harvard and say, "We're sorry to hear our son isn't doing so well at Harvard because he's doing well at Yale." So poor Jones is thrown out, expunged. His name is expunged from the record. There's a kind of irony in that, since it is not his name that was expunged from the record in the first place. But I've always wondered, in reading that story, which was a sad story in a lot of ways, what would have happened if he didn't get that C? And Jones went on to be Smith the sophomore, and Smith the junior, and Smith the senior. And then he went to law school. And then he got married, and his wife, if she so chose, adopted the name Smith. And they had children named Smith. And he retired under the name Smith, and he died under the name Smith, and was buried in a cemetery as Smith. And the gravestone above his grave read Smith. What would it be like? What would it be like once you've started on that road only to live a lie? That is the story of what happened in Russia. Write dead stories. Pay attention to dead stories, stories that seem to be over. That applies to readers as well as writers. You may remember 1980-81, there was an incident in a Midwestern town. A bully ran rampant through the town, raped women, beat men up. One Saturday afternoon, he's walking through town, shots ring out, he's killed. Police come around and ask who shot him. Nobody in the town saw anything. The police investigate for a while. Nobody in the town admits to seeing anything or anyone shoot the bully. The police eventually give up. The FBI moves in on the idea that the bully, having been murdered, was deprived of his civil rights, an incontestable rationale. The FBI asked the same questions. Nobody in the town saw anything. They never saw anything. The story was over. It is over. But for now 13 years, that same town in the Midwest has lived with the full knowledge that they are complicit in a murder, and that 1, 2, 5 among them are capable of murder, and they have spoken to no one since that time. The story is not the murder of the bully. The story is what's going on in the town now and has been going on for 13 years. That is the story, if you would dare to get it. In New York, a little number of years ago, a guy named Rodney Sumter beat a homeless man to death, held his head and beat it against the subway platform. A terrible incident that reverberated in the city and maybe some of the country, the rest of the country too. He wasn't indicted. It was considered that he was defending his 3-year-old son. He felt menaced by the homeless man who undoubtedly did menace him. And so the killing was regarded as a terrible accident. Parenthetically, by the way, the homeless man was never identified. So the story was over, but it wasn't over. Why did the story reverberate? Because in the city, and perhaps other places too, people understood that what was emblemized in that terrible act was the general public's helplessness in reaction to homelessness, the admixture of fear and rage that goes on as citizens step over bodies in the city on their way to work and do not know what to do, and do not know whether to be afraid or to be helpful or how to be helpful and how to react to their fear. That was what was in the story. The story was over. It was not over. Again, the buried life. Nothing is ever over. The mind lives in its after effects. Rule 4, go to hell. All I mean by that is discover chaos within you. It is useful. Nietzsche said, you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. When Huck Finn says, all right then, I'll go to hell, having decided to protect the runaway slave Jim rather than to turn him in, it is not a casual decision. It is truly going to hell. The adoption, the seizing, the embracing of chaos. It is treated as if it is not chaotic, but it is the deepest chaos. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. Distrust rational thought. Rule 5. We know the value of rational thought. We ought to have more interest in intuition. To trust the intuition to make guesses. Use the imagination. You watch Bud McFarlane testify in the Iran-Contras hearing, you know something is terribly wrong with Bud McFarlane, but your mind, your rational mind, overcomes the irrational mind or the intuitive mind, and you stay back until you read about McFarlane attempting suicide. Or the oddities of public life where Bess Myerson in New York, former Miss America, former head of the Arts Council in New York, appointee of City Hall, is arrested for shoplifting in Pennsylvania. Or you watch characters. We watch characters that parade before us in the public life, like Oliver North. Oliver North sounding so rational at each turn. Is there any doubt in our minds that he is crazy as a loon? But he spills, and we listen, and we know something else. Shelley said, we must learn to imagine what we know. Think of it. We must learn to imagine what we know. I work with some friends in my neighborhood in the Upper West Side of New York in a place that deals with the mentally ill homeless. A year or so ago, there was a woman named Betty who used to sing for change out in Broadway. And she was a member, she was one of the clients of this group. What we do is we put out a little newspaper. It's not much. It gives us pleasure and may do some good because we interview the clients in this place and we ask them about their lives, and then we write up their lives and they see their names in print, and it gives some certification to their lives. So it may do a little good. So I asked Betty, who was in her mid-60s, used to sleep out on the benches in sub-freezing weather, used to sing, voice rasping from cigarette smoke. I asked her if I could interview her, and she said, yes, Roger, I can give you some time, but CBS is probably coming over to talk to me, and that's how it is, you know, when you were a former Miss America, and that when you had a screen test in Hollywood and you used to date Joe DiMaggio. I asked the psychiatrist who works in the center, is there any harm in writing down these fantasies? He says, no, not if she believes them. A week before Betty died, a young woman came to the center looking for her. It turned out to be Betty's daughter, to whom she gave birth in a mental hospital in Texas, say 30 years before. And the daughter carried with her proof that Betty was a showgirl. Betty had a screen test. She wasn't Miss America, she was Miss Ohio, but she went to the Miss America contest, and she did date Joe DiMaggio. If I had listened to the irrational voice, if I'd actually listened to her voice, the singing voice, it might have seemed possible, even probable. Be beside the point, Rule 6. A variation of being out of things, but with a specific direction in mind. Look away from the action. It's the hardest thing for people, certainly the hardest thing for journalists. Backcourt basketball player for a college team asked his coach what was going wrong. He wasn't doing well. The coach says, what do you do in practice? The kid said, dribble and shoot like everyone else. In other words, he had his hands on the ball. Coach said, why don't you have somebody clock during a scrimmage how much time you actually touch a ball in a 40-minute game? Kid did it, came back, surprised, said it was 3 minutes, less than 3 minutes, and he was the point guard, so he would have his hands on the ball more than anybody else. Coach said, what do you learn from that? 3 out of 40 minutes, you have your hands on the ball. Kid says, I don't know. The coach said, most of the game is played away from the ball. Most of the game is played away from the ball in everything we observe. People tend to look at the poor when there's a tenement fire or a march on Washington, but the poor are poor all the time. If you want to understand the poor, look away from the ball. These natural disasters that we suffer. The hurricane in Florida a year ago, the floods this past summer in the Midwest. They are always described in terms of people dead, how much money was lost, property damage, all of which are real, of course. But they are rarely described in terms of what we understand them to be, which is absolute proof of our helplessness in the face of things we cannot control. The definition of modernity is control, what we can harness, what we can make do what we want to do. And then comes along a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake. Just throws us, just spins us out of control. That's what we feel. It's the last thing if it's mentioned at all, but it's the first thing thought. If you want to understand how a business operates, you can look at the profit and loss sheets, or you can look at the other statistics that would indicate whether it's successful or not. But if you want to understand what it's about, you have to ask a whole different set of questions. Go up and down a company. Ask who's thinking of what music they listen to, what they do when they get home, their patterns of speech. Who are they? What relation does work have to love? What relation does work have, do they have to their own work? How do they imitate what they do at home to what they do in work, and so forth, and so forth. Study people in repose, not in crises. There's some odd theory abroad that people, and this is often demonstrated in works of fiction, that people are most themselves in moments of crises. My observation is people are least themselves in moments of crises. that torn from the normal patterns of their lives, they become quite strange, quite different from who they are. But to be beside the point, in other words, the point of explosion, to see them in repose is to see who they are most of the time, I believe. Look away from the ball. Rule 7, avoid the company of people. It's an excellent general rule. It applies here in terms of cultivating a useful privacy, a sense of privacy. Writers can do this easier than others because writers are natural hermits and hate people generally. Coleridge once went to visit Wordsworth. He walked in the cottage, did not say a word. Wordsworth did not say a word to him. Coleridge stayed for 5 hours, neither man speaking to the other. At the end, Coleridge walked out, thanked Wordsworth for a perfect evening. The slightest question throws, and this is a slight digression, the slightest question throws writers off. Have you ever noticed a writer, if you ask him, how are you, for example, how are you? It sounds like superficial sociability. Can't. How are you? But the writer, twitchy as ever, always hears something else. How are you? Meaning, since you haven't written anything in 5 years, I thought you were in a mental hospital. It's worse when the question is sincere. How are you? How are you? The writer thinks, my God, this person really wants to know how I am. Dare I tell him? If writers were to tell people how they were, the people would never recover. You know that painting, The Scream? Writers call that painting Serenity. There is no privacy in our world. Now, I'm not for cultivating too much privacy because then we get back to the question of specializations and people atomized and leaving one another alone to some destructive end. But the idea too, Rousseau. Rousseau said, if I had to choose my place of birth, I would have chosen a state in which everyone knew everyone else, so that neither the obscure tactics of vice nor the modesty of virtue could have escaped public scrutiny and judgment. It's what the French would have called a tête case. Imagine growing up in a world where every act then becomes a public act, everything available to the scrutiny and judgment of others. It's not a question of nosiness. It's the question of not being able to cultivate those elements of privacy that wind up creating a whole person. Technology now, all these spying devices, video cameras, camcorders. You are a public figure. Take a camcorder, you're on television. Oprah, of course. I'm always both amazed, I don't know if you have the same reaction, and heartbroken when you see a family where a child has been caught in a crossfire in a city murder. And within seconds, some TV cameraman is walking up, and the parents or the relatives, close relatives of that kid, are speaking of the event to this stranger with a camera. Here's the worst thing that can happen to them, the death of a child. And they are speaking as if they have always been trained to be on television. Because in a way they have. They've grown up in a world in which every life becomes the public life, ready to be on camera as soon as the light goes on. Without a sense of privacy, you can't develop a sense of your own language. It makes the most social sense. Cultivate privacy to know the tune, because private thoughts are more complicated than public thoughts, and more confused, too, and that's valuable. Rule 8, betray your sources. I don't really mean this. That is, I don't mean to betray confidential information, privileged information given by one person to another. I mean something actually quite colder. I mean betray your sources into being something they do not wish to be before you by encouraging them to be it. To look interested in the criminal, sympathetic with the scoundrel, so that they will talk. I interviewed Richard Nixon a number of years ago. And it wasn't actually about, this first interview was not about Watergate or any of the shenanigans that went on. It was about nuclear diplomacy for a thing I was doing on Hiroshima. So we met, strange situation. 8 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of July in his office building with the air conditioning off. I asked, I said, we could do this any time. No, this was his choice. He's in a suit, of course. I put my tape recorder beside him. He looks at it and says, "Oh, that's one of those new tape recorders. They're so much better than the old tape recorders." I did not know whether he was joking. I did not laugh. I did not say, "Oh yes, Mr. President, these don't skip a minute." I did not say that. But as I say, the interview at that point was not about anything that had anything to do with Nixon's life in the White House during the Watergate. Then it came to writing a profile of him also for Time magazine, and he was then and still remains, in my mind, the most interesting politician of our lifetimes. So I asked if I could write a profile of him. Now he said yes readily, because he was very satisfied with this first piece, and he was at the time sort of collecting journalists whom he believed would be useful in the reclamation of his reputation. So he said he agreed. And then I wrote the profile of him, which was severely critical of him. And he blew up. And he blew up, and then he said that he would not ever deal with any media organization with which I was associated. His timing was poor, because at the time I was associated with Time Inc., McNeil-Lehrer, and CBS. But he didn't mean it, of course. It was just the idea that he thought he had been betrayed. He had been betrayed. I led him perfectly well into conversations that I meant him to condemn himself, if he was going to condemn himself, and he did. The betrayal works in other, more benign contexts. I just finished a piece on Lewis Thomas, the biologist, philosopher, doctor, a man whom I quite admire and have for a long time. Lewis Thomas is dying, and I wanted him to talk about his dying, but he was loath to talk about his dying, as most people are, be they scientists or not, because of the fact that not talking about it was in some way, has been in some way, a way of preserving the hope of being alive, of staying alive a little longer. But he's a doctor, and he knows what's going on inside his body. And I didn't enjoy it in any sense, but I felt that he would and I would, if we could get over the difficulty of that first conversation, get into a point where he would be as useful to other people dying as he has been to people living about life. And we talked, and sure enough, he was. That piece is going to appear in the New York Times magazine within the month, and I hope you will find, and this has nothing to do with me, I was merely the medium of this, of his words, that it's a very valuable piece. But the betrayal was necessary. When I did Children of War, I betrayed children into talking about experiences that they would prefer to bury. You betray because you want to be loyal to something else, to your understanding of who a person is or what a situation is, and what that identity can do for the readers. No other excuse, no other explanation will wash. You can follow these 8 rules, though, and still experience will elude you. In my judgment, it should elude you. There is in all writing and in reading an unspoken mystery of things we do not understand, and in many instances do not wish to understand. And by not understanding them and expressing the wish, however tacitly, that we don't want to understand them, find more of a connection with one another in that mystery than we do with anything revealed clearly. Thus the 9th rule: do not understand it. When I say this, and I've said it to others, sometimes people think that I'm just being perversely cute, that I mean pretend not to understand it. But I don't. I mean do not understand it. Create a state of mystery in your mind in which experience really is ultimately not definable. I was watching the Academy Awards one night on one station. Typical Academy Awards ceremony. People dressed to the nines, everybody, men and women, looking beautiful. All the glitzy talk and the kind of the foolish talk and the bands playing and crazy dance numbers and all the stuff that ordinarily goes with the Academy Awards. And then I flicked the remote, and they showed the remnants, the remains, literally, of that Bronx fire in the place of that terrible name called Happy Land a number of years ago, in which some 80 people burned to death or died of asphyxiation. And they showed the bodies lined up, just as on a news clip. It wasn't anything more than that. It was just the moment that I turned. And I wondered, how could both things exist in the same world at the same time? That I could be looking at the bodies in Happy Land on one channel or one line of sight, and at the same time look at the Academy Awards with all that wild celebration on the other. You begin to wonder, will they make a movie of Happy Land, of the fire? Will it win an Academy Award? What things can possibly connect these two phenomena? You may have read George Steiner's book, Language and Silence. There is a moment in that in which he contemplates something that is still imponderable. How, he said, could I be in New York, or people be in New York generally, going out to restaurants, taking walks in the park, making love, at the same time that children were thrown into ovens in Auschwitz? How can those two things happen in the same time in the same world? How would we understand time and space by those things? You don't. When I was in the Sudan again, coming back, Sudan was the worst place I've ever seen. I've seen some rough places where things were happening, but I'll tell you what made the Sudan the worst, continues to make it the worst. It has all the characteristics of places that are really ripped apart. People dying in great numbers, all murders, disease, nobody taking care of anyone else, absence of medicines and so forth. It also has, I must add, the most remarkable dignity among the people in the face of all this. That kind of inborn heroism that you don't know where it comes from in people, but it does. But the reason that Sudan looked worse than Beirut or worse than Northern Ireland or worse than Cambodia was that nobody cares. Nobody cared when I saw it then. Nobody had cared for 3 or 4 years before then, and nobody cares now. It's not like Somalia. You can go into Somalia because Somalia, at least in the original impulse to go into Somalia, you can go in there because there's no government. But Sudan does have a government. It just has a government that's knocking off all the Christians and the animists in the South in the name of some theocratic specialized principle. So it's not so easy for the UN or the U.S. through the UN to go into the Sudan. So they don't. So it will disappear. I'm telling you now, as we sit in one another's company, good, thoughtful people, at the end of a beautiful Sunday in New England, that our kind is disintegrating on the other side of the world because nobody cares. How can this happen? How can these two things be happening at the same time? We do not understand it. Do not understand it. It becomes a positive. Do not understand it. Be suffused with that mystery. It gives you power as readers, it gives you power as writers. Do not understand Rosebud. When I was doing the book, Life Itself, for which my deep thanks for the honor of this evening, it really was the same thing. I understood so much, but no more. The idea of abortion attached to the idea of recreation is still a mystery. The idea of the competition of choice or not lack of choice, and so forth. Always a mystery. Live in the mystery. Dwell in the mystery. That was the only thing that really attracted me to the subject. A man really, it's a very difficult time writing about this subject. When I was a kid in high school, to wind up, I used to go to the theater with my father. We went to Inherit the Wind. I don't know if you know that play. The older people in the audience will know the play. It was a Broadway play, it was about the Scopes trial, what was called the monkey trial. This is the evolution trial in Tennessee. It starred Paul Muni as the character who represented Clarence Darrow, and Ed Begley, one has to say Ed Begley Sr. nowadays, Ed Begley as the character representing William Jennings Bryan, and Tony Randall in his first role as the young journalist, the reporter, representing Mencken, H.L. Mencken. And you know the story. Scopes loses the case because the jury is rigged against him and the Times are rigged against him. And even though Darrow makes this eloquent, rational appeal, he loses the case. He wins the point, but he loses the case. But during the play, the character who plays William Jennings Bryan has a stroke and dies. And the journalist, at the time I surely did not know I was going to be a journalist, and the journalist, the Mencken character, is alone on stage with Clarence Darrow, the Darrow figure. And he says, "You really got him. You really showed him. You made a fool of that Bible-beating bastard." And Darrow turns on the reporter with full fury and says, in effect, "What could a man like you possibly know about a man like that?" No one should hear that question as rhetorical. Thank you.
And our thanks to all participants in the Ford Hall Forum for another stimulating evening. Good night.